Welcome to our Lunch and Learn series on Visions for 2025, initiative that was set out by the PDA Task Force a few years ago. And today's one is on reimagining risk management. So I'm Jareth Reeves, new to Protecting Success, and I'm a managing consultant here and a weathered major projects risk analyst. I'd like to welcome our guests and our panelists, starting with our CEO and visionary, Martin Paver.
Greetings, everyone. So thanks for the invite, Jareth. Looking forward to it.
Okay, good. And our product manager, Jake Williams.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jareth. Yeah, so Jake Williams, I'm product manager at Projecting Success, and I used to do a bit of risk analysis myself on various major projects. So yeah, looking forward to it too.
Excellent. And we've got three guests in, starting with Andy Murray.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you're listening from.
Love it. And Andy Allen. Hello.
Hi, Jareth. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me for today. Yeah, I'm a risk management lead for Phase 2B at HS2. But sort of most of my history is working in consulting on helping set up major programs, and got into risk management, and very supportive of getting data-driven ways forward. So looking forward to this session.
Fantastic. Welcome aboard, and to Deepak Mistry.
Yeah, I'm Deepak. I'm a director at HKA, mainly known for dispute resolution and claim services, but we've set up a new advisory part of the business that we're looking to grow. And my background's defence, nuclear, gas, electricity, transportation, primarily working in a risk management capacity, but I've had lots of different roles in the past. I suppose in today's language, I used to be an ex-data scientist many, many years ago, doing everything manually and cranking the handle. So I can relate to a lot of what's going on at the moment. So that's me.
Fantastic. And although our paths have crossed a couple of times, Deepak, we've actually worked on similar projects before in the past, haven't we? That we found out recently.
Yeah.
Exposed, which is interesting. So we got all the right people in the room then. So I wanted to kick it off with setting the scene with some context, what we're going to talk about, with opening up on what is actually the challenge that drives us. And I'd like to welcome Andy Murray to get his thoughts on, from a major projects perspective, on why things, why projects aren't delivered on time and to budget.
Well, Jareth, there's just a real complexity with major projects. You've got multiple organisations involved, and although all the good books in terms of your bodies of knowledge will say that there should be a single business case and a single accountable person who's responsible for it, in the complexity of a major project, that those sorts of assumptions just break down, because there will be multiple business cases. For the different organisations involved, there will be multiple responsible people, representing those. And then we have the challenge that there'll be some ambiguity in requirements just because of the scale of what's being expected from it. And then we've got the very long, typically the long timescales involved. So we're then exposing ourselves to change, whether that's if a project spans, say, an election, whether that's a general election at a national level, or whether that's locally with local politicians or elected mayors and so on. So you can see that there's changes of priorities can come along, and and we're seeing as well with the exponential change, the pace of change in technology, the challenge of planning perhaps something that might take 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 15 years, from idea through to completion. We haven't, our crystal ball in terms of thinking about the types of technology that are going to come along in 3 years and then be in use, say, in 5 years, and everyday use by consumers. You can see the trouble we have on major projects. So I think there's lots of reasons why they're challenging.
Yeah, thanks for that. And what we can see from the visuals I put up here, taken out of How Big Things Get Done, very popular book that came out earlier this year. from the said business school, the iron law of projects, and it's 0.5% probability of them being on budget, on time, and to benefits realised. The graph on the left shows us by project type and group what the mean overrun on cost and schedule is, and it's quite shocking, really. But I think that message has been circulated quite a lot recently. People are starting to warm up to the idea, and what you were talking about with the exponential age, it's definitely upon us. There's many things that are giving us those signals, like the amount of data availability out there is growing exponentially. I've actually not really heard of a zettabyte before I got this graph, but it's very big. You know, it's actually 1,000 exabytes, which is 1,000 petabytes, which is 1,000 terabytes, and which is 1,000 gigabytes, which is a term that is a household term now. But it wasn't that long ago where we was just talking about megabytes, you know. So maybe today in the future we're talking about data that size, and notwithstanding a lot of that data is unstructured, and that we have a new issue of synthetic data rapidly emerging. Other things to look at is the adoption of a million users on ChatGPT in 5 days compared to Netflix for 3.5 years. A lot of you may have already seen this before. The chart in the top there about software engineers and their cost is about to fall off a cliff because of how much there are more of them available, and low code solutions out there, and generative AI producing code for you. It's quite phenomenal. So yeah, the exponential age is definitely upon us. But with project risk practice, though, hasn't really changed that much, has it? So in regards to modelling risk, which is something that I've been involved in most of my career, I see organisations that can depend on a lot of things, whether it's your contract, your organisation size, project complexity, and so on. But it can range from those arbitrary decision making, adding on a couple of % to your budget, and qualitative analysis and probability impact diagrams, and so on, all the way through different types of Monte Carlo methods, even up to integrated schedule cost risk analysis to give joint confidence levels is something seen as best practice for complicated projects, and that's something that NASA has been using for many years, and they're known for poor performing projects, hence why the likes of SpaceX can very quickly take over. So I think that sets the scene, and we'll go into questions to the panelists on what is exactly wrong with risk management. Does anyone like to start? Does anyone like to dare start?
We'll pass over to Andy first of all. I think he's got some really good comments on this, so go for it, Andy.
Yeah, so I have a challenge with risk management in its current form. Jareth, has been around since the sort of late 80s, and you're right, it hasn't significantly changed. I think some of the techniques have changed, but the principles, back from when the first PRAM guide was published, it was actually in response to principally the UK government, but other governments followed, issuing fixed price contracts, and which meant that the big contractors then were gambling with their own money for the performance of the client's project. So that's when they started to look at sort of how to put monetary figures on uncertainty, and at the core of risk management is uncertainty. That's what makes it different from other project management practices, and there is a challenge with some elements of uncertainty. There's a number of them. One is that whatever we estimate the likelihood of a risk occurring, there's one thing we can guarantee, which is that it's wrong, because at the end of the project, the risk has either occurred or it hasn't occurred. So it's either a 0 or a 1. And yet we express the likelihood as a number in between 0 and 1, or 0 and 100 if you're using percentages. And that's a challenge. So when we sort of say we want to, put a response into this risk, and it's going to cost us a whole chunk of money against the likelihood of it occurring, we can never prove whether that was the right thing to have done or not. because it either happens or not. So, as overall as a whole. So we rapidly get into sort of leap of faith territory in terms of whether we believe something is more likely to happen or less likely to happen. Now, I know we've got you gave that long list on your previous slide, Jareth, around sort of QRA and QSRA and Monte Carlo and so on. But the real challenge we have there is a human one. It's a species. We're not very good at percentages, and percentages have only been around for about 130 or so years from when we had the first sort of tabulating machines. Before that, we expressed likelihood as one in a population or a number in a population. And as a species, we can understand fractions or a number in a population. 1 in 4 typically is a family unit. 1 in 10 is typically, one person on the average sports team. 1 in 30 is typically one person in a classroom that we grew up in. So we can relate to those things, and as percentages we can't. And the best example I saw of that was we all became experts in terms of our numbers, weren't we, at the pandemic? We all, we saw the briefing every day and we all sort of nodded, yeah, that means this is going to happen or that's going to happen, as the R number went from 1 point something to 1 point whatever. But what was really interesting, that was a really complex thing around trying to show the compound effect of something and the growth to come up with that sort of number. But when we started to see the vaccines being developed, and we were being offered one vaccine over another, and we were thinking about, is one better than the other, or whether the money spent on them was worthwhile, and is it worth getting a nation vaccinated as much as possible. We then started getting into percentages again. We heard that AstraZeneca versus GSK, one was 90%, one was 85%. But actually, no one knew what that number meant. And last time we had a session like this, I did a poll. I think Martin might remember. And we put it on a Menti poll, and hardly anyone got the right answer in terms of what the efficacy number expressed as a percentage was, because we just don't understand percentages. And I'll give you a really practical example of in prior roles, I've done lots of assurance work, and I was reviewing the risk approach for a complex project, and we were interrogating some specific entries on the risk register, which was then used as input to the various modelling techniques, and that's sort of real danger, that the rubbish in, rubbish out issue. But there was one on there particular that just the conversation just stuck with me for quite some time, because this was an experienced project professional. There was a risk on the risk register. It was the likelihood of a particular bit of machinery being late from the supplier, and it was on there at 30% with an impact high. So for me, straight away, my antenna, my sort of spider sense was tingling, because 30% isn't something I would normally gamble on. If there was an impact high, you wouldn't go into a medical procedure with a 30% of a high risk of failure, would you? You just wouldn't do it. But we were comfortable seeing those sorts of numbers on a risk register. So when I interrogated this particular risk in terms of 30%, so I started to use the number in a population instead of the percentages approach to the likelihood. So so I said to the project manager, if you had 10 projects like yours, how often would you expect this to actually happen? And the answer was, well, probably 1 in 10. So okay, that's a reasonable one. But there's another way of thinking about it. This particular supplier, do you know what their performance is like? So if you worked with this supplier again and again and again on multiple projects, how often would you expect this supplier to be late? And said, oh, they're pretty reliable, so 1 in 20. So in percentage terms, we're talking about 5% or 10%, not 30%. So we had a conversation about, oh yeah, I didn't think of it in that way. So yeah, you're probably right. It's probably somewhere between 5 and 10%, rather than the 30% that was already on there. You can see straight away we're now starting to see the issue with the percentages. But then the impact of high, let's unpick that as well, because that was used in the overall decision making as to what to do with this particular risk. So in terms of the impact is based upon how late something would be. So I questioned whether late meant 1 day late, 1 week late, 1 month late, 1 year late, 10 years late. And I was told, stop being ridiculous about 1 year, 10 years and so on. But actually it was, the risk of it being 1 week, 1 day late or 1 week late they could tolerate. There's enough float in the schedule they could handle that. And actually, it was a month late. So I said, well, the percentages we just talked about, which one were those related to? Well, that was sort of probably a week late, probably. So then we start, so you can see the issue we now got, and the monetary value that was in the risk register was based upon it being significantly late, not just 1 week or 1 month late. So the percentage they were used was related to the lower level impact, not the high level impact. And if we had done it properly, it would have been complete. But you can just see here, just one risk I picked on with an experienced project professional, and it just came, unfolding and collapsing into a bit of nonsense, really, as to what you really wanted to do with this particular risk. And I think that's just, for me, was a great way of illustrating our challenges with risk management. It's a challenge we've got over percentages, and it's a challenge we have just sort of general numeracy about how we then express things.
That's a really, really interesting example. There's quite a lot to unpick there, I'll be honest. So a lot of risk managers will be assessing their risk with a triangular distribution. And what you're saying is, not only are we not good at percentages, but which percentage are you talking about, of which 3 points? And we could also be having an issue on those 3 points and whether that distribution is right as well. Let's not get into whether it's sort of skewed to the left, skewed to the right, normal and others. So we've got all sorts of challenges there. And then when you aggregate them up, we've got challenges over how we treat that as well. For the typical practitioner, that is. Yeah, and the first thing that you mentioned was highlighting an issue with the integration across the rest of project control, was because you started off talking about uncertainty. And uncertainty on duration, or even estimating costs, could be in separate functions outside of risk management. So there's a bit of a distinction there, isn't there, between risk and uncertainty, with uncertainty being a type of risk. Yeah, and that's a really good point, Jareth. I mentioned the PRAM guide, the very first issue of that, if I recall rightly, estimating errors were not regarded as a risk. Because that's not driven by uncertainty, that's driven by poor estimating. So it's a weakness rather than a risk, which is uncertain. I'd like to bring in somebody else's perspective, perhaps Deepak or Andy. Alan, would you like to comment on what you think is wrong?
I don't mind having a go. I think I'd come at it from a slightly, there's so much to go out with what's wrong with risk management. I don't necessarily like using the word risk management. I think recently, having been exposed to some of the thought leaders out there, this is all about decision making, right? It's not risk management necessarily conveys a specific thing in your head, but it is about decision making. But what I'd say is, I think for me, part of the problem is this silo mentality that we have. So whether you're working on in projects, you have functional silos, like you're a planning team, we're a risk team, you've got costies, cost estimators, and project managers. And I think part of the problem stems from before people get involved on projects. And I think it's something to do with, I've been giving this a lot of thought, and this is just one opinion, but from the day that you've decided you want a career in risk management or project management or planning, you're set on a pathway, right? And you enter, risk management never used to be a profession before, right? So it's become a profession over the years. So you've got the Institute of Risk Management, you've got qualifications being offered by APM and so on. And what I feel is happening is that we've got this conveyor belt. People start on this conveyor belt and trundle along it, and there'll be other people that join that conveyor belt, like those things that get at airports, And so you're mixing with the same people along this journey. You're being exposed to the same kinds of tools, and you're being exposed to the same kind of data. And then you land on a project, you enter a discipline, and the same thing happens again. You've got these artificial constraints or boundaries between functions, and then you're exposed to your own data set. So if you're a scheduler or a planner, you primarily look at scheduling data, right? There are ways to break down some of those barriers, and this is why I like risk management, which is my chosen discipline, because we bring people together from different disciplines. And when we bring people together, we're in a really fortunate position because we get to understand their information, their data, what's important to them, what's helping them to drive the decisions that they need to make day to day. So I think there's more of a kind of like a fundamental issue with risk management rather than just about data. I mean, Andy spent a lot of time talking just now, and it sounded like specifically focused around quantification. And I think that is useful because we need something to measure, to prioritize what we should be looking at and what's important.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're being honest with ourselves, how much energy and effort do we spend in investing in looking at the actual mitigation? So if we all recognize, using common sense, that there are some problems here and they're quite difficult to solve, how many people and resources are we throwing at it? So what are the things that I'm excited about this work stream that we're working on, and technology is freeing up our time to be able to tackle some of those more difficult problems in terms of actually turning quantification into actually doing something, and it's helping to facilitate the conversations using data, breaking down some of those functional silos, having access to, because risk, or whatever you want to call it, variance or whatever, it's context specific. And at the moment, we're using some of the models and tools that you described on the earlier slide. They'll either use risk register data or schedule data, for example. Think about all of the context in other data sets that we're missing. And if you look at the trajectory of where technology is taking us at the moment, it's the beauty of it is in being able to tie in data sets from other functions, disciplines, areas, internally, externally. And if we can apply whatever technology we've got, machine learning, but then scrutinize it with that kind of human experience, I think that's where the future lies. And I think that's where the problem is. It's the silo mentality. And I think we can use data analytics to break those artificial silos down and actually bring people together like we do in a risk review.
Yeah, I do tend to agree on your point about risk management being institutionalized and needs a change. That's a very good point. So to move the conversation on, there's a few points that we thought of before. What's wrong with risk management? Some examples. Some of them we've just already covered, like the assessment methods, integration between different functions, insufficient consideration of other factors, and scope creep, and so on. But I'd like to move the conversation on how do we take account of emergence. I'd like to invite Martin in on this to describe what that is, set the scene.
Hey, cool. Thank you, Jareth. So it's back to the start of this conversation, So about 2 minutes in, we were talking about sort of Dave Snowden. Dave Snowden has done some brilliant work on something called the Cynefin framework. So what Dave says is there's two sorts of projects. There's an ordered project and something which is a complex adaptive system. So it's not the project itself, it's the work components of that project. So if you think about something like HS2, for instance, that's called a complex project. But it's not complex if you're putting down a mile after mile after mile of track. It's fairly routine, it's fairly simplistic. So we can then start to apply lean techniques to it. We can use the data because we've done 1 mile of track, we can put another mile down, and get better and better, and to leverage that data because we've seen it before. If you're in a part of a project such as Euston Station, for instance, where you're digging under it, you're not quite sure what you're going to find, some protesters turn up and they concrete themselves in there. You've got politicians who are saying, yeah, we want it, we don't want it, etc. There's a lot of turbulence in that, and some of that is not predictable, right? So it's emergent. So you then get into a complex adaptive system. In those situations, what I've found, through my career, and I've led billion-dollar projects, is what you finish up doing, your plan is just try and plan your way out of it. And you can't plan your way out of it because it's emergent. So you don't know what's going to happen next. Plus, you don't know if your intervention is a positive intervention or a negative intervention. So you're making it better or you're making it worse. So you don't know because you've not necessarily seen that situation before. You can't use all your legacy data because it's a brand new instance, so you've not seen it before. So we need to think differently about the way we manage emergence. And what people say to me is, let's try and put that into the risk register. And I say, well, you can't put COVID into a risk register and say, I'm going to assign that as a medium and I'm going to assign it as a 10% hit on the budget. It's just guessing, absolute guessing, right? So some of these are insurable risks, uninsurable risks, and it's more about putting the sensors in place, right? Putting the probes in place. So this is what Dave talks about through the Cynefin framework. So you put your sensors in place so you can start to detect that emergence early, so you can then intervene early and then see what the impact of your intervention is. And you either amplify the good stuff or you sort of moderate the bad stuff. And that's what you're trying to do through emergence. So for me, risk management isn't doing that today, because if you go back to, I think, your second slide where it says the definition of risk management, it says it's the process of. And I think that is the crux of the issue. It's process driven stuff. And most people are managing the process. They're not thinking about what we're actually trying to do. And I think that's the crux of the matter.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, I absolutely can draw many parallels with that, but I won't. I'll allow somebody else to come in. Andrew, Alan, would you like to?
Happy to come in there. And
cheers.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? One of the things that we've observed is as these projects get bigger and bigger and bigger, actually our instincts for managing those risks in the past of rules of thumb that engineers had and other things, they work in certain circumstances, but they start to fall down in others. And like Martin, what you're saying about planners, put the same rules in, get on the same jacket and go out and do the same thing, and it doesn't always work. So when we've got these large bespoke projects, particularly the bespoke ones, where we don't always know what we're defining, we can see ourselves get tied up in knots quite quickly. But for me, one of the things I'd sort of use a risk management definition of discover and positively influence risk. And actually, I quite like that one because it's moving away from the process, but actually the discovery is about making sure we understand our environment better than we have in the past. And actually, if we are in a complex environment, we need to adapt to that environment and try to work in a way that suits that environment rather than tick the same old boxes and do the same old processy based risk management we've done before. But positively influencing the risk in a complex environment is harder. And again, Martin, Deepak was mentioning, we had a sort of good chat with Dave the other day, and recognizing actually the challenges of understanding the risk and the challenges of influencing the risk. When we try to look at it through a traditional risk management lens, it looks too difficult, it looks too hard. But actually, when we look through it in a different way, we see actually there are ways we can give ourselves, the organization, we can have a different kind of posture to those kind of complex environments that help us to manage the risks. And I wonder if I wouldn't mind a couple of the things that sort of the classic problems of risk management is sometimes aligned incentives. Sometimes we know that the problem is us in that we're not very good estimators and things like that. So we know we get it wrong. And actually, I found we just need to be relaxed that data actually gives us a much better answer of how much we go wrong than thinking ahead. And the ideas of pre-mortems is almost to recognize that as humans, we're not very good when we look ahead and guess the future. We're almost better looking back and understanding what's gone wrong in the past and how we adapt in the future. And also understanding who it is that's managing the risk as well. It's risk managers. We're often trying to provide a framework for people to follow those rules. So I think there's still a big role for risk managers in creating the environment to handle risk in a complex environment, or to handle the types of problems that emerge, irrespective of what they are, so that we can positively influence them. So yeah, certainly, Martin, agree with that idea. In a very different world, and the classic lens helps in certain circumstances, but we need to grow our role and how we look at risk management to influence these complex environments.
Thanks, Andy. I believe, Deepak, you've got some ideas on the means of how to get to how we could take account of emergence. We talked about machine modeling before. Is there anything you'd like to say on that?
Yeah, I think
practicality.
Just picking up on what Andy and Martin was talking about, complexity, recognizing that different projects aren't the same, and even within a project, depending upon where you're sitting, that the context might shift as well. And one of the conversations we had this week was around recognizing that there are different, so going all the way up to different frameworks, so whether it's Scrum, Prince2, whatever you want to call it, ISO 31000, whatever. You've got that kind of level, and then you've got modules within there, and then you've also got different tools. Yeah, so whether it's running a QSRA, reference class forecasting, using something like MPlan, which is machine learning technology. I think going back to my point about silos at the start, we need to break away from thinking that there is one size fits all and one approach fits all. And what I like about project data analytics and what I've seen from hackathons and things is that there are so many different solutions out there. And I think it's a case of kind of not ripping up the rule book, but saying I want a bit of this and I need a bit of that for whatever context you're in, whether it's complicated, complex, simple, or ordered. There's different ways of tackling those things. So from my perspective, in terms of where we're heading, I think we need to be able to cherry pick what's appropriate. And we're having some interesting conversations around, motives and incentives. Well, at the moment, those organizations that are selling these products and frameworks have a vested interest in it. Let's just be honest, yeah. And so they're not going to welcome us breaking their models apart. But I think the way we're heading is that data will enable us to do that. I think we're going to be able to cherry pick what we want and to be able to adopt different processes, tools, techniques, given the context that we're in. And I believe this work on complexity science and thinking is going to be the game changer, because we're going to recognize which one of those environments and contexts we're in, and then we're going to decide what's appropriate. That's my take on it.
Yeah, thank you. Martin, have you got anything to say about what could be the blockers of actually adopting this new practice in terms of moving from the business case sanction point and then sort of winging it sort of routine?
So in terms of the blockers, there's a lot. So it's vested interest, right? Some people have put a career into this. So if we now say there's a totally different way of managing it, because it's no longer the human process of guessing what's going to go wrong and we're managing the process, what we're now saying is every event has got a distribution with it, right? So that distribution, so let's not argue about uncertainty and is it risk, is it not a risk, is it just an estimating error? It doesn't matter through a data lens, it's just a distribution, right? What we need to try and do is to understand some of those distributions, and is it sort of predisposition, or is it something? So in terms of predisposition, I mean, is a package of work, does it tend to be late? If it tends to be late, then we can look into it. Is it consistently late, which probably means you've got your estimate wrong? Or is it very, very varied? In which case, let's start to understand some of the conditionality with that and the causality that goes with it. And we don't tend to do that necessarily. So I think the blockers are, it's for me, first and foremost, we are working in this straitjacket of process. And I think it comes right from the top of government, is that we're forcing all this process down onto all of our projects. And then it's the same for the private sector as well. We're forcing the process. And I think if we flip it around instead and say, what we're actually trying to do is to minimize the downside and to maximize the upside, it's no longer then getting into the process of risk management. We're now starting to talk about, right, variance comes from change control, variance comes from logistics, variance comes from design queries. It's not just coming from your risk register, it's coming from everywhere. And that's your job as a project manager, is try and get your head around all of that. And that's what data science can do. It can cluster it in whichever sort of perspective you're interested in. So we break these silos down. Those silos are from the 80s or the 70s or the 60s even. We don't need them anymore because we look through a different lens. So I think those barriers are because we're putting the barriers there. We're reinforcing them. And what I'd like to do is to work with a team of people and to just reimagine what this could look like by taking this sort of approach. And it's all there, right? All the tools are there, all the systems are there. We've got chunks of data. It's all up for grabs. We can make this happen. It just needs a coalition of the willing to make it happen.
And where can we find that coalition, Martin?
So I think that's the purpose of these sort of calls, really, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of this month, we're trying to get enough people together to run a cohort of the Project Data Academy, right? So it's all funded by government through the training levy. So the government put the training levy in place so people can get upskilled or acquire new skills, so we drive up productivity across UK PLC, right? So that's why that training levy is in place. Instead of just training somebody on data, let's bring 25 people together and say, you've each got to do 3 projects as part of your course. Why don't you do 3 projects which is tackling this problem? And let's person number 1 pick module A, and person number 2 pick module B, and person number 3 picks module C. That would be 75 modules of capability, right? That comes as a byproduct of that investment from government, and we move the dial on risk management in one hit for nothing. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? It's insane that we're not doing it.
Well,
and that's in touching distance, right? We can make that happen as a consequence of this call today.
Yeah. Well, I'm on the course and I'm really looking forward to it.
Cool.
So I had another slide here about variance analytics, but I think we've covered it. Unless there's anybody that would like to say something. I suppose with the terminology, variance analytics is a coin that we term that we use, but what we're talking about is predictive analytics, isn't it, Martin? So we're moving from prescriptive.
It's probably worth pulling Andy.
Yeah. Okay.
So
yeah, I think you touched on this. I think you just touched on it, Martin, in terms of when you talked about the conditionality. So if we've got more insight into the distribution of likely outcomes of, say, a work package or a task, it's not necessarily just the shape of that that's useful to us. It's the things that are driving it to one end or another, or that would drive it to the mean. Then we can make decisions, can't we, in terms of how we can reduce that variance, or whether we can detect it early so we can act early. And I think, if we, through pooling of data and gaining that, insight to an aggregate level, I think that's going to be far more useful. And sort of coming back to that thing you talked about earlier with emergence as well, is also understanding when you want to use variance analytics versus other forms of risk decision making, coming back to Andy's point. So it's a really good chapter in the King and Kay book called Radical Uncertainty. So if anyone's not read it, it's a thick book, but it's actually quite an enjoyable read. But one of the examples was going through the decision making process that was used by Barack Obama to decide whether or not he gave approval for the raid on bin Laden's lair when they thought they'd discovered it. And of course, there's 2 scenarios there, aren't there? In terms of, there's a scenario that he is there, and there's a scenario that he's not there. It's on foreign soil, so there's other implications. But the way they went round their decision making on something that was fundamentally uncertain, I think, is a really good example of dealing with uncertainty on a truly one-off case. There's no other case like it. There's unlikely to be another case like that a world leader has to make a decision on. But they went through some decision-making process to come to conclusion as to what they could do and the impacts of inaction as well as the impacts of action. But I think we're talking about things that could, that are likely to be far more routine. But I think we do need to understand when you would apply, one approach to the other, sort of based upon the Dave Snowden's sort of Cynefin type framework.
Thanks,
but
Andy.
I say for me, it's the understanding of the distribution rather than the uncertainty in itself.
Yeah, sounds right up my street. I'll look into that. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
I'd like to hand over to Jake to talk about some use cases. Do you want to talk us through these, Jake?
Sure. Cheers, Jareth. I think everything that's been spoken about so far, particularly from sort of Deepak and Andy, around having specific tools for specific use cases, and I think that's going to be so important, and that really resonates with me. So I'm going to highlight a couple of examples of data analytics use cases in project risk management. And I think it's worth emphasising that these have been developed across 2 days at one of our project hack events, So in some ways they're fairly basic, but keep in mind, what could be achieved if we spent more than 2 days working on these, and we had multiple projects going on at the same time, as Martin described earlier. So this first example that's on screen shows a tool designed to flag potential concerns based on historical forecast or tender cost data against actual cost data. So the problem statement from the perspective of a project manager or a project risk manager is defined as, I want to see where the greatest cost exposure in my budget forecast is so that I can address and mitigate the risk directly, which in turn will save money on my project. So the team created a dashboard which provides average total variance and average percentage variance split down by cost component. And that's where having that specific data for the specific use case comes in. And what they did is they highlighted high risk cost components, which are likely to go over budget based on historic actual data. So the if you could just go to the next slide, Jareth, please. So the visual on screen now displays the relationship between tender and actual costs. So what the team did who tried to solve this challenge was they used a linear regression model to plot this relationship between tender costs and actual costs, before then building a feature which based on the cost component selected could provide a prediction about the forecast, provide a prediction based on the tender cost, so the forecast. So the input would be the tender cost across the top, so that's that slider going across from left to right in the top left of the screen. And the model for that cost component predicts what the actual outturn value is likely to be. So there's an error percentage of the tender cost, which is shown, and there's an error threshold which has been set at 20% for this cost component, and there's a predicted error of 15% based on the 45,000 tender cost selected, which means that for that tender cost, so the input of the tender cost is in tolerance for that particular cost component. So you can use that use case or that tool to understand whether you're within tolerance for a particular CBS or cost component. And so the team used Python, Excel, and Power BI to develop that solution, and it's something that we think can be developed even further. If you go to the next slide, please, Jareth. So this second tool or second example was taken from a challenge titled Learning from Program Updates. And the aim of this challenge was to provide a project manager with a understanding of the features of activities which are likely to cause variation and slippage, and to show the activities which were most likely to be erratic in nature. So the team received data from P6 extracts, which included baseline finish dates, actual finish dates for completed activities. And in the Power BI solution, you can see that the team identified key drivers for schedule slippage in this section 4 area of this program, both in terms of WBS and location, so that the project manager can know where to prioritize their efforts to sort of balance off that schedule. And then there's just one final slide, please, Jareth, which is the predictive element. So on this next slide, you can see a scenario builder, and this allows a user to estimate future performance based on historic performance. So the user can slice by WBS and location to estimate the slippage of a future activity based on the previous performance of similar activities. And as you can see on the screen there's two different models which can be used for prediction. So the first one extrapolates current performance in the area from the P6 data. And as you can see, this gave a 64% chance of completing the remaining activities on time. And then the second model, the lower down, is a machine learning based model. And this takes into account the features of an activity, such as the month the activity started in, or the location of an activity. and this gave a 100% chance of completing the remaining activities on time. So you can see the effects that sort of including the features of the activity itself might have on activity completion. And you can see the sort of power of machine learning. So I think both these tools, they could go into the toolkit of a risk manager and really allow them to sort of drill down and identify risk to cost and schedule.
Thanks, Jake. It's a really good insight. Are they available on the Solution Centre at all?
Not at the moment, but we'll
okay.
Sure that
we got lots of solutions ready to roll out. So we open source solutions from the hackathons, and that's where these come from. So if someone wants to drop a link in the chat, they can sign into that and they can start taking some of these out and using them straight away, completely free. Yeah, thanks for going through those for us, Jake. Martin, would you like to talk us through the 3 horizons for variance analytics before we talk about our apprenticeship and conference?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So in terms of this slide, this has been developed with the community, right? So we've done it together. But what we've said is there's 3 time horizons. So the first horizon is taking what we've got today and just squeezing a bit more performance out of it. So that's improved visuals, it'd be Power BI dashboards, it would be the automation of some of the risk process, etc. So that's the stuff that most clients will be asking for today, because that's what they understand, right? So that's what they're asking for. But that's not where the high value is, right? The high value is on the right-hand side, where we start to understand the causality of this unplanned variance. So we can start to preempt where it's going to come from. So we can start to think about driving this out of the system. Or in terms of project controls, we can't control complexity, right? It's like an oxymoron. It's imposed on you by the system and the ecosystem and the environment. You've got to go with it, right? You can't control it. You've got to go with it, and you've got to try it and experiment and try things out. So what we're trying to do with risk management then is to move it to which of those things are predictable and knowable and what we're trying to do in terms of shape that future versus which of those potentialities is a fat tail risk. So it's the things at the end of a distribution which we don't really anticipate, but it may happen. And what can you do to chop off the fat tail of that distribution and bring it more into your mean? And that's what we're trying to do through risk management, basically, is we're trying to make it more sort of deterministic. So in terms of this, what we're trying to do is say, let's work together. So if we've got thousands of people working together through the hackathons, we can all bring challenges in and say, let's now start to get some of those solutions, which is Horizon 1 in terms of risk process automation. All of that is possible today. Each organization is doing it individually at huge expense. Let's just do it once and we can open source all those solutions. So that's what we're talking about doing, which means we'll go really, really fast on it because we'll just open source everything. And then that starts to drive up the data volumes. And then when we've got the data volumes, we can start to unlock Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. So it's things like the automated assurance of risk registers. So when people are putting things in there, is it the right things they're putting in there? So you can have almost like a password score on it, right? Is that a good risk or not? So we're still talking risk at this point, and then we move towards the North Star. We start to talk about variance analytics. So I think you got another slide of you, Jareth, about the personas.
No,
we took it out. Right. So the personas are. So if you think about the risk managers today, the risk managers today are the process type risk managers, right? We're managing the process, we're not managing the risk. Where we'll be in the future is variance analysts, right? It's the people who can get under the skin of all of this uncertainty and variance and estimating sort of probability curves, etc., and start to understand from a stats viewpoint, what does that mean for the project? And this will be the most valuable person on a project. So if I was a project manager, I want to listen to that person because they're going to tell me what's going to happen next. They're going to tell me where to spend my contingency. They're going to tell me what to look out for because somebody's about to trip me up. Those people will become extremely valuable. Yeah. and potentially the most valuable person on a project, because they're the people with a crystal ball.
Yeah,
I think that's the really exciting thing. So that time horizon 3 is what starts to unlock that crystal ball, basically. So we move away from process and now start to move away from value added. Don't tell me about what's happened 3 months ago. I want to know what's going to happen in 3 months' time.
Thanks, Martin. I'd like to open it to the panel. What do you think this means for risk professionals, and what's the implications for your projects?
I'm happy to come in there.
Thanks.
Yep. So yeah, I think it's fascinating all the way through from the conversation about some of the blockers that we have in our kind of predefined roles and predefined process. But ultimately, that aim of discovering risk and knowing what to do about it, sort of the upside and the downside, influence, however we positively influence the environments or the risk we're working on, we need to be constantly challenging ourselves to look for new and better ways of doing it. And I think the challenges that we've always had in discovery, the technology enablers that we have to measure the data that's going on for more real-time analytics and data is something we need to absorb. We know as individuals we're not very good at assessing risk. Let's start using other systems to help us do that. And then in terms of the challenging of the influence, I mean, I think, Martin, one of your bubbles on the top right is that those elements of understanding causality, but also how are our interventions working, and when in an environment where we don't know whether our intervention is going to be a positive or negative influence. So the forums that you've got set up in terms of getting everyone in a room and simulating the project and allowing yourselves to test different ways of influencing the project and putting people into roles that they can then take away back into their work to influence the day-to-day roles for us. That's what I want to take away from today, is how do we go back into an environment and redefine those roles for an environment of complexity rather than the roles that are set up for an environment that may be complicated but actually still quite structured. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy.
Very eloquently put, Andy. I can't really follow that as eloquently as you, as usual. But what I would say is, everyone's been focused on technology, data analytics, variance analytics, and what you just talked about. But just remember, right, the human dimension. And this is where I take a balanced approach. So whilst I'm all up for technology, and I'm fully supportive of the mission here, and it's got to happen, I think we need to recognise that when we're looking at variance and trying to make sense of those distributions and data, we bring it back to people. And this is where we as risk professionals have those facilitation skills, bringing people together, those domain experts that can kick the tires on whether that makes sense or not. And we've been doing that for years. So we've got the core skill set. All we're doing is building our armory of toolkit, if you like, to enhance that even further. So that's what I'm taking away from this. So I'm hoping that technology takes us to a point where we automate the mundane, take all the manual processes away from us, and that gap that we leave, we build on what we've just said, using that technology, using that data to bring people together and ultimately, improve project outcomes. That's what we're trying to do, reduce the variance proactively.
Yeah. Thank you, Deepak. So how you can get started is register your interest.
Can I just jump in? I mean, that's sort of just stolen a bit of the thunder I wanted to include on that bit about the human aspect. So I think it's really exciting times ahead for risk professionals because, you've got on the one hand, I think, in terms of you said there about what should they do, I think, they need to be curious. They need to be looking at, what the opportunities and the how it can impact their ways of working are likely to be. But in terms of that human aspect that just mentioned, I think the real value of risk professionals going forward is going to be on the narrative and how they can explain and help inform better decisions on projects based upon the insights gained that they've been able to get from the analytics, at their fingertips. And so things like storytelling and visualization, I think, is going to be really useful. And also acting from an education perspective, mean, I did a poll in a workshop, last year, in terms of some, again, a bit like I did with the COVID example, but how many people that sit on, say, project boards or steering groups truly understood SPI, CPI, and very few. And yet we put them in a report and we expect our senior leaders to make decisions based on them. And again, it's this challenge of how can we explain what those things mean in a way that enables better decision making. So I think it's an exciting time ahead for risk professionals in terms of having this power at your fingertips, but then turning it into something which is, like the project advisor almost, in terms of helping that decision making.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time on that note. But to get started in your data analytics journey, register your interest with this level 4 qualification on data analytics for risk management starting the 30th of August. Don't get put off by the date. Register your interest if you are interested. There's a link above, bit.ly/risk data analytics, or just visit our website. And we've got some upcoming events. We've got Project Hack on the 3rd and 4th of October. Register and come along for a 2-day hackathon. If you want to get involved in our conference, then we will be running conference on the 2nd day of Project Hack at the same venue, Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. Click on the links or go to our website to find out more. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining and for the panel. I think that was an excellent session. Martin, would you like to come in with some closing remarks?
It's a brave new world that we're in, right? I think it's a really exciting world. Embrace it, right? It's with us. It's all over your phone. It's all over your computer anyway. Get good at this stuff. So back in the day, I was around when sort of Microsoft Office first came out and Excel came out. It's the same now. It's just a bit cooler, right? This is really cool tech. And for risk managers, it's just going to give you superpowers, right? It's a brilliant world to be in. Just jump in. So there's a question as well from Lisa about the course. Should you do the general course first? It's the same course. We're just tailoring it around the risk management use case, right? It's exactly the same course. So we'll just twist all the way through it. So the assignments you'll be doing and the exercises will be based around risk management, right? So that's what we're trying to do, and variance analytics. So these will be the thought leaders who get to shape where we take it next. So yeah, brilliant. And please get involved in the hacks, right? The community hacks, you all come together, we create these solutions, and then we open source them for the benefit of everybody. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you?
Exactly. So the talk today went on for the full hour and didn't have time for question time. But if anyone has got any questions, don't feel shy of reaching out. You can email me, jareth@projectingsuccess.co.uk. And thanks for coming.